Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending January 25, 2025. Our first story comes to us from the Financial Times that, most interestingly, Friedrich Merz, the head of Germany's Christian Democratic Party and the leader for the next election in Germany, described China as an axis of autocracy and says that German companies that invest in China are taking a very high risk because China does not abide by the Western rule of law standards. He is quoted in the articles as saying, "I say to all representatives of the German economy that the decision to invest in China is a decision involving great risk." End quote. So companies such as Volkswagen, BASF, and a wide variety of others could be in a world of hurt. Next up, from the New York Times Deal Book, the war, literally, against DEI is ramped up. And the Trump administration is going to war against DEI, and probably the next step will be discrimination, where they will try to destroy anti-discrimination. But they have told the federal workforce that they have to report colleagues who fail to purge efforts of DEI. So they have, I don't know what you might call that. One person was quoted in the article as saying that was forcing us to inform on others. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Next up from Aljazeera, the Vietnamese police announced dismantling of a $1.2 billion money laundering ring. The Vietnamese police said 5 people were arrested, that between 2022 and 24, members of the ring, which included bank employees, forged ID cards and bank seals to establish 187 businesses, opening more than 600 corporate bank accounts. The accounts were used to transfer and legalize money obtained through fraud and gambling abroad, in transactions totaling $1.2 billion. Next up, from the BBC, Ukraine's chief army psychiatrist has been arrested on corruption charges of over $1 million. What was he selling? Well, he was selling deferments to keep people out of the army. If they did not meet the mental health standards, they would get a deferment. So, pretty interesting work from psychiatrists in Ukraine. Next up, a story of bribery and corruption in the world of international soccer, as Leite, a former player for Everton in the Premier League and the coach of the Chinese national team, has been sentenced to jail of 20 years for bribery and corruption. He found guilty of leveraging his position as head coach of the National Football Team and Selection Committee. In exchange for these bribes, he would select certain individuals for the national team, as well as help clubs win competitions and sign players. No word on whether he threw games at Everton, but he also played at Sheffield United and making 34 appearances in the Premier League. So yet another sad commentary on international soccer and corruption. Next up, the first of a couple of different stories from Bloomberg. This one reports that the KPMG is under investigation yet again by UK's accounting regulator, the Financial Reporting Council, this time for its work on the British gambling company Entain. The FRC said the investigation focused on the audit ending in 2022. The gambling operators attracted increased regulatory scrutiny, which led to increased fines. So KPMG under the microscope again. Our second story from Bloomberg is that whiplash in tariffs, as Trump's tariffs whiplash puts trading partners on edge. Remember, this is the person who said not that we're going to put tariffs on our enemies or our biggest competitor, but on our friends. So he has kept people guessing about what's going to happen. He's held off on unveiling China-specific tariffs, but he said he's going to put tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Well, why be America's friends if we're going to get treated worse than you do enemies? And I think that's going to be an important question. Next up, from the Financial Times, Apple is hit by a Belgian criminal probe over blood minerals from the Congo. Belgium has started a criminal probe into allegations that Apple has knowingly sourced blood minerals from the Democratic Republic of the Congo in what lawyers from that country have called a massive laundering and greenwashing operation. In December, the DRC filed criminal complaints in both Belgium and France against subsidiaries of Apple, and lawyers for the DRC have said prosecutors in Belgium will also be looking or will be looking at this. So not quite sure where Apple stands on all of this, but it's obviously very, very serious. And if Apple is caught by hook, nook, crook, intentional or otherwise, it's going to be very serious for their reputation. The lawyer representing Belgium says this is the first step which shows the prosecutor takes this case very seriously. The criminal complaint alleges that Apple buys tantalium, an ore extracted from coltan, as well as tin, tungsten, and gold, the so-called 3TG minerals, from mines whose profits stoke war in the eastern DRC and promote child labor and environmental degradation. Next up from the BBC, the former head of Marks & Spencer and Asada has opined that working from home is not real work and that people who do so are not doing proper work. So there, for all of you who want to work at home, you're not doing real work. This inane attitude ought to be relegated back to 1840, but nevertheless, that seems to be the attitude of many corporate CEOs today. And finally, trash compliance. Well, it's a real thing as the city of New York is considering the deployment of, finally, a story from the Gothamness, not someone who is quoted in this podcast or any other compliance podcast I know of very often, yet they wrote about trash compliance. So trash compliance is a real thing, and New York's sanitation department is considering enlisting drones in its war on cash. What are the drones going to do? Well, they're going to see whether businesses, apartments, and even individuals are in compliance with trash regulations. For 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.